Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Chris. I always hate going right after Chris because he's so good. And did I hit something? Oh, okay. But again, good morning. Dana Rickman, president of the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education. And before I dive into my spiel, very little bit about the partnership. Most of you are familiar with our work. For those of you who aren't, we were formed back in 1992 by a partnership between the Georgia Chamber of Commerce and the Georgia Economic Developers Association. At that time, and frankly, I'm not sure it's gotten a whole lot better, the corporate community in Georgia wasn't really satisfied with the quality of the workforce coming out of the public education system, but they didn't know how to partner. They didn't know how to talk or advocate or figure out how to solve this problem. So the Georgia Chamber and the Georgia Economic Developers Association got together, they had a meeting, they had a study group, they produced us. We were born to be that partner, that connecting voice between corporate and education. We're an independent, nonprofit, 501c3. Chris sits on my board, I sit on his board, and obviously we partner very closely with the Georgia Chamber, but other chambers and the corporate community across Georgia, and really look for how do we really blend economic development opportunities and education opportunities. And what I want to do today in this presentation, the economics of education, I want to challenge you all in the room, especially those of you who are not educators or in the education industry, to think differently about education and really think about not as President Cabrera said earlier, sort of the old-fashioned way of playing chess, but how can we think about the education pipeline from early learning all the way through post-secondary completion and adult training and reskilling? How do we use that as a powerful tool in our toolbox to make sure that the economic engine that is Georgia keeps going and keeps growing for everybody? And so that's what we're going to do this morning in 22 minutes and 50 seconds. Got a timer. So this is what we call the healthy economic life cycle. Represents the stages of individuals that you go through in your life. You're born, you go to school, you go to college, you get married, you have kids, and they go through the same life cycle. It's the growing economic pie, right? It's the American dream. It's what makes me more successful than my parents, and my hope that my children are more successful than me. If you participate in it, everybody wins, everybody grows. But what happens when the clicker doesn't work? There we go. We have also what we call the poverty cycle. There are cracks in that cycle, and if you drop out of it, if you fall out of that that economic life cycle, a lot of times through no fault of your own, if you didn't graduate high school, think about if you didn't graduate high school, or your children or your grandchildren, what does their world look like, right? What would be their current job prospects? How much money would they make? Where would they live? What's happened in Georgia, especially since the recession, and it got a little better, but it still threatens us now, is that more and more people are being trapped in this poverty life cycle. And we have communities in Georgia that have generations of disinvestment, where they're trapped in this cycle. You live in a community where the average person has not graduated high school, or maybe just graduated high school. Children are born into those communities. They're exposed to much higher levels of toxic stress. They go into our school systems not ready, not prepared, and then they drop out. And so it just keeps going. And so as more and more people fall out of it, it affects us all, right? And so we have all of these great plans to keep growing Georgia's strong economy to be the best place to work. If we don't have the workers, as a state, we're going to start feeling those effects, and there's going to be a tipping point where we can't grow anymore. So what do? I like this slide because it's dated, but it's an important beginning to our story here. Before the pandemic, so this was done near the end of 2019, right at the beginning of 2020, our friends at the Southern Regional Education Board did a study of Georgia, and they predicted that due to automation and changing economic cycles and things like that, by 2030, 4.2 million workers will be affected by automation in the coming decade. That would leave potentially about 1.5 million workers either stuck in low-wage jobs or simply unemployable. Now notice I said unemployable, not unemployed. Unemployable meaning they don't have the skills necessary for the jobs that were available, and then again, trapped in this endless cycle of poverty. This was in the end of 2019, end of 2020. You can kind of see where this story is going. And so what's causing this crisis, right, that we were facing even before the pandemic? Two main things. The first, automation. There are good jobs out there for those with the right credentials. You've seen Chris's slide. President Cabrera talked about this. Chris talked about this. Automation is really changing the world of work. Industries are going through wholesale changes. Restaurants, grocery stores, even gyms are all moving virtual or more online. There are lots of jobs, but the skills required to fill those jobs have changed. Now, here's the thing that we need to remember. The argument a lot of people make is that machine is taking jobs. It's not exactly true. That machine is replacing jobs. But the jobs that it's creating, somebody had to program it, somebody had to design it, someone had to manufacture it, deliver it, install it. God willing, there's someone who can repair it. I don't know how many times you guys have gone to check out and there's an out of order sign, right? So we need people to repair it. But the skills for all of those different jobs are much different than the skill of the person who this replaced. And so as we go through all of this automation, a lot of these jobs they're just changing. And so what are we seeing as a result of that in our labor market right now? Chris went over this in detail, so I'm just kind of going to fly by it. But our biggest growth industries, we have a lot of opportunity right now. Our biggest growth industries, healthcare, logistics, manufacturing, all of those require some sort of automation, some sort of different kinds of training that we have to think about. And so this first factor that was contributing to the poverty life cycle, changing economic trends and automation. The second factor, Chris mentioned this as well, 40% of Georgians currently, 25 and older, have no credential or degree beyond high school, right? Now, that statistic may have worked fine for previous generations. Previous generations, you could get a good job at the local factory or in agriculture, and you could have a family-supporting career. That's no longer true. For manufacturing jobs, they don't need people to sort the widgets. They need someone to program the machine that sorts the widgets. In agriculture, you don't have to have someone to move the sprinklers anymore. Shows you what I know about agriculture. But they need a drone pilot now to monitor the irrigation system and someone to do all of that. Lots of automation in every single kind of industry that we have, which requires something beyond high school. Now, to be clear, as I go through this presentation, when I talk about post-secondary, I am not necessarily and almost not really talking about a 4-year degree, right? What we need is beyond high school technical skills, associate's degrees, technical diplomas, some sort of training into a career, a family-supporting career that will get us there. And so second is the education level of our population. And I hope that you can read this. The specific numbers, maybe you can see the trend here. The education and talent barriers don't affect all communities equally. But if you look at this, it does affect everybody. Even in the bachelor's degree or more, where you see about over 40% of the white population, no particular community is really kicking it out of the park. Everybody's struggling. But you can see that there are disproportionate struggles across different categories. And in particular, the one that concerns me is the sum college. A lot of these folks in the sum college are carrying large amounts of debt, but they have no degree. And so that really limits their opportunities of what they can do. And also, an important note, this is statewide data. If you take out the metro Atlanta area and you look at sort of not Atlanta, these numbers get even worse. And that's especially a concern, as Chris was talking earlier, we have a lot of economic growth going on in our rural areas. And so do we have the commensurate supports in our education system, which Bronwyn is going to talk about later, to really meet that need? There we go. With confidence, I need to press this button. It's also a changing student body. Chris mentioned this before, the alpha generation and for the millennials as well look much different than our current generation. I have 2 alphas running around my house. They're 6, and I can tell you, you were not prepared for this level of energy, and you're not ready. But looking at our changing student body, we talked about, getting a degree of value is not equally distributed across different populations, it's a changing student body. We're going to be a majority-minority state by 2050, and our minority populations are students of color. They are not progressing as fast as they should, so we need to look at subpopulations as well. And so to reach our goal, 65%, now Chris says 66, need a post-secondary credential of value. And so how do we get there? Business leaders in the room, we need to start thinking about public education as an important tool. How do we strengthen that pipeline? How do we make sure that everybody gets through? More students need to get through into college, post-secondary, and we need to think about the community services and regional supports for the students and their families of how to do that. So let's look at how to do that. First, it is the responsibility of the public education system, early learning system, post-secondary system to move people through the pipeline, right? But when you think about if no water comes out of your faucet, there's a couple different ways why you don't have water in your house. There could be a clog in that pipeline. Our state systems, our public systems are in charge of keeping that unclogged, right? But if there's a crack and all the water is just leaking out, you need services and support to wrap around that, to really insulate that pipeline, to make sure that the water stays in the system and it's free of debris. And so let's look at the state of this pipeline right now. This slide is actually a good news slide. Hang in there with me on this. Post-secondary access. If you take a random sample of 100 Georgia ninth graders, they enter high school. 84 of them are going to graduate high school on time. That's our average state high school graduation rate. Of those 84, 63 are going to enter into some post-secondary institution of education, technical school, USG system, within 18 months of graduating high school. That's a very encouraging number. And the reason that's so encouraging is the average high school student understands they need something beyond a high school diploma. So they're applying, they're getting in, they're enrolling. Success story. However, of those 63, only 53, sorry, I have my glasses, make it to their second year. Right? And so when I say make it to their second year, I don't mean complete 2 years of post-secondary. I mean actually just enroll, come back for a second year. And so across our pipeline from ninth grade to enrolling in a second year of post-secondary, we're missing about 47% of our kids. The reason that's a good news story is I just updated this recently, and data from 2 years previous, that number was 57% we're missing. So we're moving in the right direction. And so really think about, we've done things, and we're going to hear more about, CTAE pathways that are really tightly tied to local industry. College and career academies, apprenticeship programs, stackable credentials with the high demand career initiatives. Getting students engaged in understanding the relevancy of their learning and how they fit into a potential career track for them and themselves. Make the learning real and make it really connected to the needs of the community. And so for our business leaders in the room, I encourage you to really get involved with different strategies that may already be in place around your community to help support these efforts, so that 47%, when I come back next year, maybe it's down to 37%. Backing up on the pipeline, this is 8th grade math. It's from the NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Education Progress. It's the one test that's given in every state to really benchmark how students are doing on track to be ready for college and career when they graduate high school. The most recent NAEP numbers said that approximately 76% of Georgia 8th graders were not proficient in 8th grade math. That is a significant problem, especially when we talk about the big growth industries in Georgia are associated with STEM, AI, sort of all of these things. And so it's not just looking at the kids coming out of high school and keeping them engaged into post-secondary. We need to back up and make sure that as students enter 9th grade into their freshman year, they're equipped with the tools for success. And right now, on average, that's a struggle. And that's, to be clear, this is a struggle that is across the country. This is not a Georgia-specific problem. This is a problem that everybody is dealing with right now. You back up a little bit more. 68% of our fourth graders are not reading proficient according to the NAEP, and they may never catch up. And I know there's been a ton of conversation around literacy in Georgia. See me if you want more about that. But I'm down to 9 minutes, so we're going to move on. And then backing up, the impact of early literacy. I think everyone in the room by now should really understand how important early literacy is, that foundational skills, the long-term impact it has not only on the individual students, but on the local economy, businesses, and everything else, and state resources. As students grow up, are they going to be contributors to the economy, or are they going to need to be supported by it? And so the impact of literacy and making sure that every child reads on grade level is essential. Now, I want to take just a moment to look at this. This is the last time you'll hear me say the word gap. When we compare different subgroups traditionally in the education space, we talk about achievement gaps. And I'm getting ready to prove to you why that's the wrong language. This is, again, the same NAEP scores that I just put up. And I know it's kind of hard to see. Even I can't see it, and it's in front of me. But it's basically looking at if you break out proficient, fourth grade reading and eighth grade math, there are significant gaps by race and by income, right? So on average, you can see the story here is that white, non-poor individuals significantly more likely to be proficient in these areas than students of color or low-income students and English language learners as well. And traditionally, that is portrayed as a gap, right? And the reason I don't like that is that it puts the onus on the student. Like, you are behind. You should have learned more. You need to do better. There's a gap for your performance. However, I'm going to flip the script a little bit. For those who can read on grade level, right, the gaps go away. Now, here's a graph that's a little bit more complex, but what this shows, this is Georgia data. These are Georgia students. This research was done by the Governor's Office of Student Achievement. And it took the end of grade reading test scores of third graders. When those third graders graduated high school, so the same kids, they matched, did they graduate high school on time with if they were meeting, exceeding, or did not meet the third grade reading standard. And then they broke it out by race and income. And what you see, if you guys can read this, and at that year in 2016, the state high school graduation rate, I believe, was 78%. So if you look at black students, where we said there was an achievement gap, if they met or exceeded third grade reading, if they were reading on grade level, they graduated at or higher than the state rate. Same with Hispanic students, even economically disadvantaged students. What this tells me is that it is not an achievement gap. It's a resource opportunity gap. If a student gets what they need to be able to read on grade level by third grade, they will graduate high school just like everybody else, regardless of their background, their zip code, even English language learners. So thinking about meeting the student where they are, giving them the resources that they need, these gaps go away. And we're talking about a whole different story. That's really important to understand. And so how do we do that? Well, the challenges we've been talking about, the challenges that Chris talked about, that these are shared challenges not just of the education system, but of all of us, right? They hit every sector. And one sector doesn't have the same piece of the puzzle as everybody else. But the overarching need is consistent. We need more people to make it through post-secondary training into the workforce, and even once they're in the workforce, to keep up with needed training as the economy shifts, right? But where do we start? Think about your region, if you're in a region. Think about the state, if you're at the state level. What's your growing industry? What type of workforce does your community need right now? And importantly, what kind of workforce do you need tomorrow and 10 years from now? And really try to understand the dynamics of who you're serving and where you're drawing from. And one way to do that is through data. Those of you who know me, I love data. My Twitter X handle is DataDana. I'm not going to do a bunch of, I love a good scatter plot, but I'm not going to do that for you. What we need to do is look at your local data, however you define local to yourself, and we recommend using what we're calling an opportunity dashboard, right? The answer to my question is going to be different for every sector, every part of the state. And the answer is not go through all of these and figure out what your problem is, right? These are a list of different types of things to look at when identifying what's your particular pinch point in your area. Do you have a lot of young families, a growing population of young families? What does the early learning system look like? Over in Augusta, they got the Cyber Academy, so they might want to look at STEM pathways in post-secondary entrances in STEM areas, right? And so pick one or two indicators of these that really sort of hit where your greatest need is. And I'm going to give you a quick example on how to do a deep sort of opportunity dashboard dig into what this data might tell you. And so this example, this is real data from an actual district in Georgia, and I actually called both GOSA and DOE to make sure that this data was correct. Now, this data was collected from 2019, so this is pre-pandemic. But when most people look at third grade reading scores, they look at that top level, the district average, and when they want to look at what we're calling now resource gaps, and they look at the difference between white and African American students, and they say, oh, 50%, 18%. Big gap there. Most people will stop there, right? You dig a little deeper, and they'll say, oh, well, it's not race, it's poverty. Poverty is often used as a proxy for race, because generally people of color are overrepresented in the poverty population. So you're like, okay, let's see if it's poverty. When you control for poverty, and you look at two groups of students that basically the same income level, we still have a gap between white and black students, between 38 and 17%. That's still a gap, so there's something else going on. So let's dig a little deeper. I am a big fan of data is a tool. You're a data detective. Data's not the answer, it tells you where to keep digging. So you dig a little more. These two schools, schools A and B, I looked them up on a map, they are 1.7 miles apart from each other. And so you see one school, very poor, predominantly students of color. School B, not nearly as poor, a lot more neighborhood resources, it would seem, primarily a white school. You look at the reading levels there. 3%, that's the number I called to make sure that everything was okay. Like, is this a typo? No, it's not a typo. And when I presented this to that district, the district themselves were surprised. They're like, oh, that can't be. Like, well, and they checked. And so the question here, as we think about insulating our pipeline, yes, there's a lot within the school that probably needs to be done. So if I'm talking to school leaders and district leaders, it's like, where do all of your first-year teachers get placed? What's the tenure of the principal at the high-performing school, right? What does the media center look like between each school? But then you talk to the community, because a lot of this, neighborhood transitions, crime, if you're in a high poverty area, that affects schooling. So you think about what's the transportation system, after school programs. Is the health clinic open? There was a rural area that the health clinic was open for free immunizations, to do the immunization check to enter kindergarten, every other Wednesday from 12 to 2. That was it. Okay, barrier. So thinking about things like that, like what's causing these numbers and where can you help? And so to sum up, I'm going yellow here. Another press. Everybody has a different piece of the pie, right? Talk to each other and understanding what the various needs are and where they overlap, and put this puzzle piece together. And so when you work there at the sweet spot, and finally, we get this a lot. We get communities where there's a ton of great work going on, but it's not aligned, and it can be overwhelming to people. Some alignment, you can move your goals, but when you are keyed in and totally aligned on a specific goal, like you could really just sort of change the world. And so thinking about barriers that are keeping people from your workforce. They second chance, were there mental health struggles? Is it transportation? Is it childcare? How do you put insulation around that pipeline so the school systems can do their job and get the students through? Community, connected, and collaborative. So everybody participates. Keep in touch. Thank you. And I'm